Do you believe in life after death? Today, I'm going to share an incredible and life-changing story of a near-death experience which revealed impactful messages about love, life, and a great transformation that will happen in 2025. Before we start, comment below which city you're watching. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe. Subscribe to the channel to follow more impressive stories like this. Let's go. My name is Phoenix Caldwell, and what I'm about to tell you is not something I usually share. I'm an ordinary person, and my life today is simple, like anyone you know. But there is something in me, something that perhaps is also in you, that has changed forever after what I have experienced. At 16, my life reached a point where I almost ceased to exist, but it was there, at the end of the path, that I found the beginning of everything. If you're willing to listen, I promise this story has a purpose. The rain tapped against my car windshield like restless fingers, creating a jagged symphony as I drove through the empty streets of Charleston. It was late, almost midnight, and my head felt heavy after 12 straight hours in the hospital. The shift had been chaotic. Children crying in the emergency room, patients arriving in critical condition, and me, as always, running from one place to another, trying to do the impossible with limited resources. I turned on the windshield wipers to see better, but it seemed like the rain was getting thicker every second. I sighed, adjusting the radio in an attempt to find some relaxing music. Nothing seemed to work. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and I barely noticed that my eyes were closing, even for a second. What happened next was as quick as lightning. A bright light appeared on the left side, headlights of another car, advancing at high speed. There was no time to react. All I felt was the crushing impact and the deafening sound of metal being twisted. Then, silence. It was as if the world had stopped. I opened my eyes, but saw nothing, just a deep, crushing darkness. I tried to move my hands, but my body didn't seem to respond. There was no pain, but there was no movement either. I was there, suspended in the void, not understanding what was happening. Suddenly a thought crossed my mind. Is this the end? I remembered hearing stories of people talking about the moment their lives flashed before their eyes before they died. It wasn't my case. Instead, I felt a strange, unsettling calm, as if I was waiting for something I couldn't predict. That's when it happened. A light began to appear, very distant at first, like a small flame on the horizon. It grew quickly, enveloping the darkness around me. It wasn't like any light I had ever seen before. It was pure, bright, and alive, as if it had an intention of its own. I couldn't explain how, but I felt like that light was calling me. My heart, or whatever my being was at that moment, seemed to pulse in response. I tried to fight it, perhaps out of instinct, but the light was irresistible. I was pulled toward him like a piece of iron drawn to a giant magnet. And then, suddenly, there was no more darkness. I was in a completely different place. The streets of Charleston, the rain, the car, everything was gone. All that was left was light, and a sense of peace so deep it made all my fears evaporate like mist in the sun. The last memory I had of Earth was the sound of a distant siren, like an echo from a dream. When I realized, I was standing up. I don't know how it happened, but there I was, in a place that seemed to have no floor, ceiling, or horizon. Around me, everything was bathed in a light so intense that it seemed to invade my soul, but somehow it didn't hurt my eyes. There was no heat or cold, just an indescribable comfort, like a hug that was not physical, but spiritual. The colors around me were vivid and pulsating, but none of them resembled the colors on Earth. There were tones that I couldn't describe, something between gold and amber, but with a depth that seemed to contain entire stories in each hue. Then came the sound. It was a song, but not like any melody I had ever heard before. There were no instruments that I could identify, just harmonies that seemed to flow from the very space around me. Each note seemed to reach something deep inside me, awakening memories and feelings I didn't know I had. I looked at my hands. They were no longer the same. They were translucent, made of something that looked like condensed light, but at the same time solid. It was as if I had a body, but I wasn't limited by it. I lifted my feet, hoping to feel the ground, but there was nothing. Still, I didn't fall. I was suspended, supported by something invisible but firm. As I tried to understand what was happening, a soft voice echoed around me. It was no ordinary voice. It was as if every word was spoken directly to my heart. Adeline, you are safe. I didn't know where the voice was coming from, but I felt a wave of calm and acceptance. There was no more doubt or fear, just the certainty that I was where I was supposed to be. The light began to change, taking on a more defined shape. It wasn't something I saw with my eyes, but something I felt with my entire being. She seemed to dance, spinning in patterns that left me mesmerized. And then, from the middle of this dance, a figure appeared. It was a person, or at least it seemed to be, but at the same time, it was more than that. This figure was pure light, but it also had a shape and contours that resembled those of a human. "Who are you?" I asked, but my voice didn't come out as sound. It was as if my question had been asked directly into the mind of this figure, and he responded with a smoothness that was almost melodic. "You are about to understand," the figure replied. At this moment, the light around me began to expand, revealing a vast space that seemed to have no end. I was in a place where time and space didn't have the same meaning as they did on Earth. Suddenly, I felt something new, a familiar presence, something that warmed my heart in a way nothing else could. Before he could understand what was happening, a new figure emerged from the light. "My girl," said a voice that made my heart almost explode with emotion. There she was, my grandmother Margaret, younger and more radiant than any memory I had of her. She was there, smiling at me, and the love in her eyes was as tangible as the light around me. When the figure of my grandmother Margaret emerged from the light, a whirlwind of emotions washed over me. It was as if time had gone back, but at the same time, I knew it wasn't a memory. She was really there, more alive and full of grace than she had ever been in life. "Your grandfather?" The word came without a sound, but she heard it, as if my every thought was being shared without barriers. She smiled a warm smile, a smile I hadn't seen since I was 16, when she held my hand for the last time before leaving this world. Only now, she wasn't the tired, fragile woman I remembered. She was rejuvenated, as if every mark of pain and suffering had been erased. Her skin glowed with a soft glow, and her eyes reflected infinite peace. "My girl," she said, but her words didn't come from her mouth. They seemed to be transmitted directly to my heart. "I knew this day would come, but don't worry, you're not here to stay." The intensity of his words was accompanied by a love that seemed to wrap around me like a warm blanket on a cold night. For a moment, all I could do was cry, not out of sadness, but out of joy, out of relief, out of gratitude for seeing her again. She reached out her hands to me, and as I approached, I felt something I can't fully describe. It was like a hug, but not physical. It was a connection so deep that it transcended touch. I felt everything she was: love, wisdom, and a spiritual strength I didn't know existed. "You have so many questions," she said, laughing softly, as she did when I was a child and filled her afternoons with childish curiosities. Grandma, where are we? What is happening to me?" She looked around, as if appreciating the beauty of where we were, and then turned her attention to me. "You are in a place of transition, my dear, a place between the world you know and what lies beyond, and you are here because you were chosen." Chosen? My mind was flooding with questions, but before I could ask any more, she continued, "Yes, chosen. There's something you need to see, something you need to know. But don't worry, you're not alone." His voice had a tone of tranquility, but also of purpose. It was as if she knew exactly what was coming, but was waiting for the right moment to reveal it. She held my face in her hands, and although they weren't physical, I felt the same care and love I always felt when she did this on Earth. "Adeline, remember who you are. This is all part of something much bigger. And now, I need to introduce you to someone." Before I could ask who, she took a step back. The light around us began to change again, becoming even brighter, as if the universe itself was preparing for something sacred. "He's coming," my grandmother said, with a smile that radiated reverence and joy. I didn't know who him was, but something inside me seemed to know. My heart began to race, but not from fear. It was as if every fiber of my being was preparing to meet the source of all that is good and true. And then, out of the light, appeared a figure I would never forget. When the figure emerged from the light, my soul immediately recognized who it was, even before my eyes could understand. He was both human and divine. His presence was imposing, but full of tenderness, radiant, but in a way that wasn't blinding. It was like looking into the source of light itself, and yet feeling enveloped in a love so deep that no words could describe it. "Adeline," he said, and the sound of my name coming from his voice was like a wave of life that coursed through every part of my being. It wasn't just the sound, it was the meaning, the weight of the name. He spoke with so much love and purpose. I fell to my knees, not by choice, but because it seemed the only possible answer before him. The ground, or whatever supported my feet, seemed to bend at his presence. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't feel sad. It was as if my heart was overflowing with gratitude, humility, and reverence. He approached and extended his hand. I hesitated for a moment, feeling unworthy, but he spoke again. "Do not be afraid." When his hand touched mine, I felt something inexplicable. It was as if every hurt, doubt, and weight I carried was instantly lifted. My soul felt lighter than ever. "You know who I am," he said, looking straight into my eyes. His eyes, there was nothing like them. They were like infinite wells of compassion and wisdom, but also of unshakable authority. "Yes," I replied, although I wasn't sure how the words came out. "You are Jesus." He smiled, and in that smile was the answer to all the questions I never knew I had. He did not need to explain who he was or what he represented. His presence was the explanation itself. "Adeline, you were brought here for a purpose," he began, his voice soft but charged with meaning. "What I am going to show you is not for your benefit alone, but for the benefit of many. You were chosen to be a messenger." A mixture of emotion and fear coursed through my being. "Why me? I'm just an ordinary person. I'm not special." He tilted his head slightly, and his expression became even more tender. "Those who consider themselves ordinary are often the ones I use to do extraordinary things. What matters is not what you are, but who I am in you." He gestured, and the light around us began to change. It was as if an invisible screen had appeared, showing images and visions. Each scene was so real that it felt like I was living it, not just watching it. "Look," he said, and my attention was immediately captured. I saw crowds looking up to the heavens. Bright lights danced in the air, like a celestial spectacle. The people around were amazed. Some were crying with joy, others were kneeling in worship. Then, figures began to descend from these lights. They looked like angelic beings, radiating beauty and purity. But something was wrong. Despite their divine appearance, there was a subtle darkness that surrounded them, something that was almost imperceptible but unmistakable to those who looked at them with discernment. "These are the false messengers," Jesus explained, his voice full of sadness. "They will come in my name, but they are not of me. They will deceive many." I saw them speaking, quoting passages from the Bible, but in a distorted way. They denied the divinity of Jesus and promoted a spirituality that appeared beautiful on the surface but was empty on the inside. Religious leaders, people of faith, were falling into deception, attracted by the sweet words of these false teachers. "The media will amplify your lies," Jesus continued, showing me images of screens, phones, and social media where millions were being influenced by these messages. "Even many of mine who are not rooted in my word will be seduced." I wanted to scream, to warn those who were being deceived, but Jesus held my hand again. "There is hope," he said. "The truth will prevail to those who listen to my voice." He then looked at me again, and in that look was a weight I knew I would never forget. "Adeline, you must warn them. Tell them to discern. Not everything that shines comes from me." After showing me the first revelation, Jesus made a gesture, and the images around us began to change. The previously spreading darkness was replaced by a soft light emanating from within the people. It was as if hope was being born, even in the midst of chaos. "Now see what's coming," he said, his voice filled with strength and tenderness. Before me stood a vision of people of all ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds. They were in their homes, workplaces, schools, and even on deserted streets. Suddenly, something began to happen. A light seemed to emerge from within them, not from without. This light, Jesus explained, is my presence. For many, it will be the first time they have felt my love in such a profound way. I will personally reveal myself to them. I saw scenes of individual meetings. An elderly woman, sitting alone in her living room, suddenly began to cry as she was enveloped by this light. A young man, previously filled with disbelief and anger, fell to his knees in the middle of a parking lot, feeling the presence of Jesus undeniably. A teacher, in an empty classroom, looked up at the sky with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what he previously considered a mystery. This will be the great awakening, Jesus said. It will be something the world has never seen before. My light will reach those who were lost, those who never believed that I exist. Many will come to me, not through buildings or organizations, but directly, in their hearts. As I watched, I noticed small groups were forming. People gathered in homes, schools, offices, not in large churches or events, but in common places. They shared their experiences, prayed together, and sought to understand more about Jesus. There were no famous leaders or big productions, just sincere hearts hungry to know the truth. These groups, Jesus continued, will be the focus of my revival. They will transcend cultural, social, and denominational barriers. I will unite my people in a way the world cannot understand. But then, the images started to change again. The light was still shining, but now I saw people being met with resistance. Families were divided, brothers against brothers, parents against children. Some who had experienced the light were rejected by their own communities, labeled as bigots or liars. That will be the persecution, Jesus said, with sadness in his voice. Those who genuinely follow me will pay a heavy price. Many will be rejected, excluded, and marginalized, but it will strengthen your faith and prepare you for what is to come. I saw people being fired from their jobs for their beliefs, students being ridiculed by their peers, and families being torn apart over spiritual differences. It was painful to watch, but at the same time, there was a strength in these people's eyes that couldn't be erased. This will be the cleansing of my church, Jesus explained. It will be difficult, but necessary. Those who remain steadfast in me will not only endure, but they will shine even brighter. They will be the salt and light in an increasingly dark world. For a moment, I was silent, taking in everything he had shown. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to process the weight of these revelations. But what should I do? I finally asked. How can I help these people? He held my hand again and looked straight into my eyes. Tell them not to fear. Teach them to trust me, to be rooted in my word, and not to depend on human systems. The awakening will be the greatest evidence of my love and power, but they will need to be prepared. Visions began to fade, and the light around us softened. I knew what came next would be even more challenging, but something inside me had changed. I wasn't the same anymore. As the visions of the Great Awakening began to fade, a heavy silence took over the room. I felt my heart speed up because I knew something more was coming. Jesus turned to me, and in his gaze there was a gravity that I had not yet noticed before. Now, Adeline, he said, his voice firm but full of compassion, I will show you what will be called the Great Shaking. The entire world will be shaken, and the true nature of people's faith will be exposed. Suddenly, I was transported to a vision that seemed so real that my body almost reacted as if it were there. I saw entire cities shaken by natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, and storms of unprecedented magnitude. Buildings collapsed, and crowds fled in despair, seeking refuge. There was confusion, chaos, and a palpable fear that seemed to permeate the very air. But the physical disasters were just the beginning. I saw economies collapsing, governments being challenged, and conflicts breaking out between nations. The world was in disarray, as if the entire structure upon which humanity had built its security was being dismantled, piece by piece. Jesus spoke again. The great shaking will not just be external, it will be internal. He will expose people's hearts, revealing where their faith really lies. As he spoke, the vision changed. I saw people who previously professed faith in God, but now, faced with difficulties, abandoned their beliefs. Religious leaders who were once admired were empty and unable to offer answers or hope. Churches that were based on appearances and traditions crumbled. unable to withstand the pressure of the moment. But look, he continued, and his hand pointed to another scene. I saw a small group gathered in a simple room. There was no luxury, no great structures, but there was something that transcended all of this, the presence of God. These few were on their knees, praying fervently, leaning on each other and sharing what they had, even if it was little. The light emanating from them was so intense that it contrasted with the surrounding darkness. "These are mine," Jesus said, with a tender tone. "They do not depend on wealth, position, or human power. Their faith is genuine, and they will remain steadfast even when everything around them falls apart." I saw these small groups growing, not in numbers necessarily, but in spiritual strength. They became points of light in a dark world, attracting those who sought hope in the midst of despair. During the Great Shaking, Jesus explained, the divisions between true Christianity and superficial practices will become clear. Those who truly know me will stand firm, but those whose faith is just a facade will not stand. As he spoke, I felt a mixture of fear and hope. The weight of this revelation was crushing, but there was also an implicit promise of redemption and renewal. Jesus looked at me again, and his next words were engraved in my soul. "Adeline, tell my people they need to prepare, not with fear, but with faith. They must root themselves in my word, strengthen their prayers, and build genuine relationships with one another. When the great shaking comes, those who stand firm in me will not only survive, but will prosper spiritually. They will be the light that guides others into my kingdom." The images began to fade, and I once again felt the comforting warmth of his presence beside me. He held my hand once again and spoke, this time with a tone of urgency mixed with unconditional love. "Remember, Adeline, all this is not to destroy, but to purify. My kingdom is unshakable, and so will those who abide in me." I felt tears streaming down my face, but it wasn't despair. It was a sense of purpose, of calling. I knew that what Jesus had shown me was not something that was easy to carry, but I also knew that it was something that needed to be shared. The light around me began to soften, and a feeling of movement enveloped me. It was like something was pulling me back, but not against my will. Instead, it seemed like part of a larger plan, an inevitable unfolding. "Adeline," Jesus' voice echoed softly around me. "What you saw is just the beginning. Now you must go back." My heart sank. Part of me wanted to stay in that place of indescribable peace, beside him, away from the pain and chaos I knew in the world. But I knew it wasn't my choice. There was a mission I needed to accomplish. "How will I know what to say? How can I convince people of something so great?" I asked, my voice thick with doubt. He smiled, a smile full of patience and love. "You are not alone. I will be with you. Trust me and speak the truth. Those who have ears to hear will hear." With those words, I felt a last wave of heat emanating from him. It was as if he was leaving a piece of his presence in me, an anchor to remind me that I would never truly be alone. Suddenly, everything went dark again, but this time, there was no fear. I felt a stronger pull, and in the blink of an eye, I was back in the world. The first thing I noticed was the sound, busy voices, machines beeping, and someone calling my name urgently. My eyes slowly opened, and the fluorescent light of the emergency room seemed brutal after the heavenly glow I had left behind. "She's coming back. We have a pulse," shouted a male voice. I saw blurred faces above me, doctors, nurses, all looking at me as if they had seen a miracle. My ears were ringing, and my body felt heavy, but I was alive. "Adeline," said a familiar voice. It was Dr. Grayson, the doctor who had taken care of me at the hospital for years. His expression was filled with relief, but also something else, a mix of confusion and awe. "You've been technically dead for over 20 minutes. We have no explanation for this." I looked at him, trying to find the right words, but all I managed was a whisper. "I saw something I can't explain right now." He stared at me for a long moment, but just shook his head. "Rest is all you need to do now. We will take care of you." Over the next few days, as I recovered, I realized that my experience was something I couldn't keep to myself, but I also knew that sharing what I had seen wouldn't be easy. At the hospital, some people looked at me with admiration, while others looked at me with skepticism, as if they were trying to rationalize the impossible. My closest friend, Caleb, was one of the first people to visit me. He entered the room with his usual skeptical manner, but his expression softened when he saw me. "You gave us all a fright," he said, sitting down next to the bed. "So, what happened? The last thing I heard was that you were dead, and now it's here, as if nothing had happened." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "Caleb, I saw something. I saw Jesus." He laughed, but in a nervous way. "Jesus? Like Jesus?" I nodded, keeping my gaze steady. "Yes, he showed me things about what's to come. It's not easy to explain, but I know it's true." Caleb stared at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to dismiss it all as delusion. But then he said something that surprised me. "Adeline, you have always been the most practical and down-to-earth person I know. If you're saying that, you must really believe it." "I believe it," I replied, more firmly than I expected. "And I want you to believe it too. What I saw is not just for me. It's for all of us." He didn't say anything else, but I could tell something had changed in him. Perhaps a seed had been planted. When I was released from the hospital, I imagined my life would return to normal, but I quickly discovered that normal was something I would never get back. Each person who heard my story reacted differently, some with genuine curiosity, others with skepticism, and many with open disbelief. Caleb was one of the first people to really confront me. Sitting in my living room, he held a mug of coffee in his hands, looking at me as if trying to decipher a riddle. "So," he began, stirring his coffee, "do you really believe you saw Jesus?" "It's not a matter of believing, Caleb. I know I saw it," I replied, firmly, but without anger. "He spoke to me, showed me things to come. It was more real than anything I've ever experienced." He laughed, but not in a disrespectful way. It was a nervous laugh, full of doubt. "Adeline, you are an intelligent person, and a nurse, for God's sake. Know how the brain can react under extreme stress. What happened to you could have been, I don't know, a dream, a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. Don't you think?" I stared at him for a long moment. "Caleb, if it had been a dream or a hallucination, why would I be so changed? I saw things that cannot be explained. What's more, what he showed me has already begun to happen." "Like what?" He raised an eyebrow defiantly. "Remember the lights in the sky that were in the news this week? I saw this before it even happened. It's just the beginning, Caleb. And I'm not trying to convince you. I just want you to be prepared." He was silent, visibly uncomfortable. "I don't know, Adeline. Just be careful, okay? People will start to see you as crazy if you keep saying things like that." With Caleb, at least, there was an openness, even if he was reluctant to accept what I said. But with other people, the skepticism was crueler. Some of my fellow nurses started avoiding me. Others confronted me directly, accusing me of using the experience to get attention or of imagining things. There were times when I wondered if perhaps it had been better to keep everything to myself. But in each of those moments, Jesus' words came back to me. "Tell my people to prepare." It was then that I met Rebecca Holloway. She was a local pastor who had heard about my story through a mutual friend. When she came to visit me, her presence brought a calm that I hadn't felt in days. "Adeline," she said after I had told her everything, "I believe you." My tears started to fall before I knew it. "Do you believe it? In truth?" She held my hands and smiled. "Yes, and I'm not the only one. God has used experiences like yours to awaken his people. What you saw was a revelation, but also a calling. And I'm here to help you understand how to share it the right way." Rebecca became a mentor to me, someone who helped me find clarity in the midst of confusion. From her, I learned that my mission was not to convince skeptics or win debates. It was simply speaking the truth with love and leaving the results in God's hands. Meanwhile, Caleb began to show signs of changing. He appeared more frequently, asking questions that began cynically but increasingly became sincere. One night he asked me, "What if you're right? What if these things really happen? What should I do?" I looked at him, feeling the urgency in his voice. "Trust in Jesus, Caleb. You don't need to be perfect or know all the answers. Just open your heart to him. That's what he wants, for you to know him." He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me something was happening inside him. As the months went by, I began to realize that my mission was more about living the message than just proclaiming it. Although I still faced skeptical looks and scathing comments, something inside me remained unshakable. The experience I had was not just an event, but a transformation. Rebecca was a constant figure in this process. In our conversations, she always reinforced the importance of focusing on sharing the message with humility and grace. "Adeline," she once said, "you don't need to have all the answers. Just trust that God will use you exactly as He intended." These words became my guide. I started attending small meetings organized by Rebecca, where I shared my experience with people who were willing to listen. It wasn't about convincing anyone, but about planting seeds of faith. One night, on one of these dates, something unexpected happened. As I described the vision of the Great Awakening, the inner lights emerging in people, the personal encounters with Jesus, a woman named Evelyn began to cry. This happened to me," she said, her voice shaking. Everyone turned to her, including me. Evelyn continued, "I was at work, typing up a report, when I suddenly felt a presence so strong that it made me stop. It wasn't something I could explain, but I felt like someone was with me, speaking directly to my heart. I knew it was Jesus. His words echoed in my mind. Here was living evidence that what Jesus had shown was beginning to happen. I looked at her with tears in my eyes. "Evelyn, this is just the beginning. He is reaching people in ways we never imagined. You are part of this." From that moment on, I realized that my mission was not just to warn of the difficult times ahead, but also to inspire hope. Hope that, even in the midst of chaos, God was present, working in people's hearts. Meanwhile, Caleb continued to visit me frequently. He still maintained a skeptical stance, but I could see the subtle changes in his questions. He wanted to know more, even if he wouldn't openly admit it. One night, he showed up at my door with a serious expression. "Adeline, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, giving him space to enter. "Do you really believe that Jesus can change someone, like me?" His voice was full of doubt, but also a deep desire to believe. "Yes, Caleb," he said with conviction. "He changed my life, not because I was special or because I deserved it, but because He is love. And that love is available to everyone." He was silent for a moment before muttering, "Maybe I'm ready to try." That moment was a turning point, not because I had said anything special, but because Caleb had finally opened his heart. He began to accompany me to meetings, listening and participating little by little. My mission of hope began to expand in ways I never could have planned. Small groups began to emerge in places I would never have imagined. In the coffee shops where I used to get my morning coffee, among colleagues at the hospital, and even at impromptu gatherings in parks. It wasn't a grand mission, and I didn't want it to be. I wasn't interested in fame or recognition. I just wanted to be faithful to the calling Jesus had placed on my life, to live His message and share His light wherever I was. The light that I had seen in the visions, the light that came from within people, was now becoming reality. Not because I was doing something extraordinary, but because God was working in ways that surpassed my understanding. Each day, I remembered Jesus' final words during my experience. "My kingdom is unshakable." These words not only strengthened me, but also guided me as I helped others find the same hope and faith. 2 years have passed since that day I was pronounced dead for 21 minutes and 49 seconds. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, reliving the images Jesus showed me, the deceived multitudes, the awakening in the darkness, and the great shaking that would separate the superficial from the true. But along with these memories comes a deep peace, the same peace I felt in His presence. My life in Charleston changed in ways I never could have predicted. Although I continue to work as a nurse, my view of the world and the people around me is completely different. Every patient I care for, every colleague I meet in the hallway, is an opportunity to share love and hope, even if in silence. Rebecca often reminds me that my mission is not in grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but in the consistency of a life that reflects the message of Christ. "People will see the light in you, Adeline," she says, "and that will be enough for many of them to start looking on their own." And that's what started to happen. I didn't need to force my story on anyone. Instead, those who were ready came to me, asking, listening, and eventually sharing their own experiences. Caleb, for example, is living proof that the awakening Jesus promised is underway. He not only overcame his skepticism, but became one of the most ardent supporters of the message I carry. "I thought I needed proof," he once told me, "but what I really needed was the humility to accept that I don't know everything." He now leads a small group in his own home, where people from different backgrounds, skeptics, nominal believers, and even atheists, come together to explore what it means to seek truth. Still, the journey has not been easy. There are days when I feel the weight of disbelief and opposition. Colleagues at the hospital still murmur about me, and some even accuse me of being delusional or seeking attention. But at these times, Jesus' words echo in my mind. "You are not alone. I will be with you." These words are not just a memory, are a promise. And every time I close my eyes to pray, I feel his presence, as real as that day he held my hand. Now, more than ever, I understand what it means to live with purpose. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being available to God and to others. It's about being a light, even when the darkness around you feels overwhelming. The revelations Jesus gave me were not to cause fear, but to prepare and strengthen. He knew that difficult times would come, but he also knew that his light would always prevail. On one of the last nights I spent with Rebecca and Caleb, we reflected on everything that had happened since my experience. Caleb, holding a Bible, said something that stuck in my mind. "No matter what the world throws at us, what matters is that we know who we trust, and he is unshakable." Rebecca smiled, her eyes shining with joy. "That's it," she said. "And each of us, with our little lights, is part of something much bigger." As I write these words, sitting on the porch of my home in Charleston, the evening breeze carrying the smell of the sea, I feel immense gratitude. Not because my life is perfect, far from it, but because I was reminded of something the world often forgets, that even in chaos, there is order, even in pain, there is redemption, and even in the darkness, there is light. And that light never goes out.